I had dreamed of this moment for years. The smell of snow, the warmth of home, the echo of laughter under twinkling Christmas lights. After 8 long years of serving my country, I was finally coming back to Elmridge for the holidays. I could already imagine my mother's green bean casserole, the mismatched ornaments on the tree, the porch light flickering like always. I packed carefully chosen gifts, a new dress, and a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas would be different. But as my plane touched down, one message shattered everything. Christmas is better without you, don't come. It was from my father. For a moment, I stared at the screen, hoping it was a mistake. Then, without another thought, I typed one word: understood. My name is Madeline Ford. I'm 28, a discharged Army officer, and until that message, I thought I still had a place in my family. But I was wrong. What came next would force me to confront 8 years of silence, betrayal, and a truth I never saw coming. Before everything unraveled, my childhood in Elmridge had been the kind that lingered like a soft memory, vivid and warm. We lived in a colonial-style house on Chestnut Lane, with creaky floors and ivy climbing up the side of the porch. I was the eldest of three, the one expected to set the example, and for a while, I did. I excelled in school, played varsity soccer, volunteered at the library. My father, Gregory Ford, would introduce me to his friends at the hardware store as our future CEO. He meant it. My family had run Ford's Home Essentials for 2 generations. To him, legacy wasn't just a concept, it was the spine of our identity. As a teenager, I spent summers behind the register, stocking shelves, learning the real business. He had a plan for me: business major at Penn State, a managerial internship, and eventually taking over the main branch while he retired to advisory glory. I knew every shelf in that store, but as I grew, I knew something else more clearly. I didn't want that. I wanted more than small-town rhythms and product inventories. I wanted purpose, challenge, the world. My father didn't understand. He believed ambition outside the family was betrayal. At first, I tried to compromise, studying international relations, joining ROTC. But the moment I told him I was considering active duty, the air turned ice cold. He said nothing at first, just looked at me like I'd slapped him. That night, he sat me down. I still remember the words, not yelled, but quiet and final. Your uncle died in uniform. He was 22. I watched my mother bury her favorite child. I will not go through that again. Didn't know how deeply his younger brother's death in a foreign war had scarred him. He never spoke of it growing up. That night, the weight of that history fell between us. I tried to explain this wasn't rebellion, it was calling. He didn't care. I still see the look in his eyes when I told him I'd signed the papers. Disappointment, yes, but more than that, fear. When I left for basic training, my mother cried as she packed homemade cookies in my duffel bag. My younger brother Caleb gave me a thumbs up and said, "Kick ass, Maddie." My little sister Fiona just clung to me, speechless. My father wasn't there. My mother said he had a store emergency, but I knew better. His silence was louder than any argument. At first, I thought he'd come around, that once he saw I was safe, thriving, he'd soften. I sent letters, photos, even medals home. My mother responded sporadically, always saying Dad was busy. He never wrote back. When I called, if he answered, it was brief, formal, distant. My siblings stayed in touch more than he did. Fiona would sometimes text me a selfie from the store. Caleb called when he could, but it wasn't enough. Still, I tried. Every Christmas I sent gifts, monogrammed gloves, local chocolates, books I thought they'd love. I pictured my mother unwrapping them, Fiona teasing Caleb, my father quietly setting mine aside. I refused to believe the love I'd grown up with had disappeared. It had to be somewhere underneath the anger, waiting. I even started writing a letter to him that fall, not as a soldier, not as a daughter begging for approval, but as a woman who had seen enough of the world to understand fear. I wanted to tell him I understood why he was afraid, that I no longer needed him to change, just to acknowledge I hadn't betrayed him by choosing differently. But I never sent it. I didn't know if he would read it, or if it would only deepen the silence. Yet the hope remained, somewhere beneath the weight of years and grief and pride. I still believed reconciliation was possible. The first year, I chalked it up to adjustment. Deployments were chaotic and communication was spotty. But even then, something felt off. I'd send photos from the field, my squad posing with local kids, sunset over the base, even a picture of me pinning on my promotion, and get no response. I assumed the letters were lost or that my father didn't know what to say, but the silence deepened. My mother's emails became shorter, phone calls were brisk. Once, she asked me not to send any more photos in uniform. "It makes your father uneasy," she said quietly, as if the war could reach through an image and hurt him. Fiona stopped replying altogether after a while, and Caleb's updates felt filtered, cheerful, but surface level. The deeper things, the little inside jokes, the sibling closeness we'd once had, gone. When I came home on brief leave during my third year, I didn't go to Elmridge. I met up with Caleb in DC, and even that felt strained. He asked about my deployment like someone interviewing a stranger. I asked about Dad, and he deflected. "You know how he is," he said, with a shrug, but wouldn't elaborate. Later, when I saw photos of the family Christmas online, I noticed something gutting. The photos I had mailed home weren't on the mantle. They weren't anywhere. Had they ever been displayed? I confronted my mother gently on a call, and she hesitated. "We had to make room for the grandchildren's photos," she said, a sweet excuse. But Caleb had no kids, and Fiona was still in college. The truth was clear. I was being erased, one silent step at a time. During my 5th year overseas, Fiona graduated. I sent flowers, a heartfelt note, and asked Caleb to record her speech, if he could. I never saw the recording. I wasn't invited to the virtual celebration. When I asked about it, my mother said the Wi-Fi at the venue was poor, and it all happened so fast. The next year, I learned from a military friend who still lived near Elmridge that Fiona had been hired to help manage the flagship Ford store. The job was once promised to me. It was why I had worked every summer growing up. No one told me, no one asked my thoughts. It wasn't that I expected the role. I'd long since accepted my different path, but the silence about it stung. Worse than the exclusion was the casual way it was done, like I wasn't part of the equation anymore, like the decision was natural because I was never really around. I became the distant cousin in family stories, the one who travels a lot, not the daughter who had once been groomed to inherit it all. I sent a group message one Christmas with a photo of my unit, standing in front of a tree made of stacked ammo crates and tinsel from care packages. No one responded, not even a thumbs up. For weeks, I let that silence fester. I imagined my father reading it, rolling his eyes, deleting it. I imagined my mother seeing it, then quietly deciding not to show him. At times, I thought I was being paranoid, that maybe I was overreading it all. But the accumulation, the missed birthdays, the one-word replies, the promotions unacknowledged, the packages returned unopened, became undeniable. One year, I mailed a framed medal and a letter to the store it was signed for. No one ever mentioned it. By my 7th year, I'd stopped expecting anything. I still sent gifts out of habit or hope, I'm not sure. I kept my tone bright when I called. I kept my visits rare, opting instead to see old army friends or explore my own when on leave. I told myself I had my own life now, my own people. But some part of me still checked the mailbox on my birthday, still paused before pressing send on a group chat, wondering who, if anyone, would answer. Even my military family noticed. Rachel, my closest friend in the unit, once said, "Your face changes when you talk about home, like you're bracing for a hit." I laughed it off, but she wasn't wrong. The hurt had become chronic, woven into the fabric of every call, every silence. I had become a stranger to the people I loved most. Not because I left, but because they closed the door behind me when I did. I thought I was ready. When my discharge became official, I bought a new dress for Christmas dinner, picked out carefully chosen gifts, a leather-bound journal for Fiona, a vintage record for Caleb, a sapphire scarf for Mom, and for Dad, something more personal. In an antique shop in Munich, I found an old brass compass. It was weathered but elegant. I had it engraved with the words, "To find your way home." I thought it was symbolic, a quiet offering, a peace gesture, maybe even a bridge. I messaged Caleb the details of my flight. "I land Christmas Eve afternoon," I wrote. "Let's surprise Mom." He was thrilled. "She'll cry," he texted, followed by a string of emojis. Mom had always dreamed of having all her kids under one roof for the holidays again. She sent me voice notes with excitement, rattling off her baking plans. "I'm making your favorite casserole and that fudge you used to sneak before dinner." Even Fiona replied with a neutral but polite "see you soon." Dad didn't say anything, not a word, but I told myself silence was better than rejection. I wasn't expecting a red carpet, just a seat at the table. The plane touched down at 4:42 p.m. The sky over Elmridge was gray and heavy with snow clouds. As I turned my phone back on, 3 messages came through. One from Caleb, "On my way." One from Mom, "Drive safe, sweetheart." And one from a contact I hadn't seen in months, Dad. It read, "Christmas is better without you. Don't come." That was all. 9 words, no punctuation, no hesitation. I read it 3 times, waiting for it to change. It didn't. My hands trembled. The bag with the compass felt suddenly heavier. Caleb's truck pulled to the curb just then. He stepped out, arms wide. "You're shorter than I remember," he teased. I handed him the phone without a word. He read the message. His face changed from confusion to disbelief to rage. "This has to be a mistake," he said. "Maybe someone used his phone." "Do you believe that?" I asked. He didn't answer. I shook my head. "I can't go to the house, not after this." "But Mom's expecting." "She doesn't know," I interrupted. "Please don't tell her yet. Just say I got delayed." He argued, he pleaded, but in the end, he respected my decision. He drove me to a hotel on the edge of town. It was quiet, nondescript. As I checked in, he looked heartbroken. "None of this is right." I tried to smile. "Welcome home, huh?" That night, I sat in the hotel room with my suitcase unopened. The gifts stayed packed. I ordered room service. I didn't eat. I turned on a holiday movie but left the sound off. My phone buzzed, messages from Mom, a selfie from Fiona by the fireplace, Caleb asking if I was okay. I replied only to Caleb, "Safe, please give me time." The next morning, Christmas Eve, I walked through town in a fog. Every street was decorated, every storefront glowed. I passed the toy store I used to visit with Caleb, the coffee shop where I wrote my college essay, the alley where Fiona and I once set off fireworks after prom. Everything looked the same, but I didn't belong. At Riverside Park, I ran into Jessica, my best friend from high school. She was pushing a stroller, surprised to see me. "Are you staying with your folks?" she asked. I hesitated. "Not exactly." She looked confused, "But your dad said you weren't coming, that you had military paperwork and couldn't get leave." Of course he did. We ended up at a small cafe. I told her everything, the silence, the message, the truth. She was stunned. "That's not the Greg I remember." "Maybe it is," I said, "or maybe he never forgave me for leaving." Jessica leaned in. "That's not okay. You served your country. You deserve to come home." Her words warmed me, but they didn't erase the pain. The next day, I stayed in bed. I avoided my phone. I watched snow fall outside the hotel window and wondered if they'd notice my absence at dinner, if Dad would explain it away, if Mom would cry, if Fiona would roll her eyes. I pulled out the compass, turned it over in my hands, read the engraving, "To find your way home." What a joke. Until a call came. Caleb, breathless, panicked. "Maddie, It's Dad. He had a heart attack. We're at St. Vincent's. He's alive, but it's bad. The world tilted. I'll be there in 20, I said. I changed in 5 minutes, heart pounding. On the way, I imagined every possible scenario. Was he conscious? Would he want to see me? Would he even recognize me? At the hospital, I met Caleb near the entrance. His face was pale, eyes red. Mom found the message, he said. She saw what he sent you. We all did. Maddie, I'm so sorry. Inside, Mom clung to me like a lifeline. I didn't know, she whispered over and over. I thought you didn't want to come. He told us you were too busy. Fiona stood behind her, silent, but she didn't look away. For the first time in years, I saw tears in her eyes. Not for our father, but for what had been broken. They didn't know. All this time, they truly hadn't known. And in that terrible, gut-wrenching moment, as machines beeped and antiseptic burned my nose, I realized something. My fight hadn't been with my family. Just him. Just one man's fear, weaponized as silence. Now I had a choice, stay or run again. I stayed. Hospitals have a way of suspending time. White walls, fluorescent lights, the ceaseless hum of machines. I sat in the waiting room of St. Vincent's, surrounded by my family, and yet I'd never felt more alone. My mother's hands were folded tightly, knuckles white. Caleb paced. Fiona scrolled her phone, pretending not to glance at me. Eventually, a nurse appeared. He's stable, she said, but sedated. You can see him one at a time. Mom went first, then Caleb, then Fiona. When it was my turn, I hesitated at the door. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear. Tubes ran from his arms. Beeps marked his pulse, strong but irregular. His face looked older than I remembered, more fragile. This was the man who built shelves with bare hands, who once lifted me onto his shoulders to see fireworks. I sat down. You win, Dad, I whispered. You didn't have to say it with words. You erased me in silence. I didn't cry, not yet. I just stared, searching his face for any trace of the father I once knew. What I saw instead was exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. The cost of carrying his fear for so long had hollowed him out. I stayed 5 minutes, 10, then slipped out before the weight crushed me. Outside, Mom was waiting, her face crumpled. Maddie, I'm so sorry, she said. I thought you knew we missed you. I thought you didn't want to come back. I tried, Mom, I said. I wrote, I called, I sent photos, I sent medals, I waited. She covered her mouth. He told us you stopped writing, that you chose your new life, that you were different. I was, I said, but I never stopped being yours. Caleb pulled me into a hug. He had no right. Fiona was quiet. He thought he was protecting us, she said, from grief, from another loss. The sentence hung in the air. No one defended him, but no one condemned him either. Over the next 2 days, we lived in shifts. Hospital chairs became beds, vending machines our kitchens. I started noticing things, how Fiona always brought extra blankets, how Mom smoothed Dad's hair even when he couldn't feel it. Caleb updated relatives. I kept to myself. One morning, I returned from a coffee run to find Mom in tears. He woke up, she said, asked for you. I hesitated. Is he lucid? She nodded. Clearer than I've seen him in years. I found him staring at the ceiling. His eyes shifted toward me as I stepped in. You came, he said. His voice was gravel and guilt. You told me not to. A long pause. I was wrong, he said. I was afraid. I know. He reached out, not for my hand, but toward the drawer. I opened it. Inside was the compass. He had it in the hospital? I opened it that night, he whispered. I couldn't sleep. Silence stretched. I thought I lost you, he said. You almost did, I replied. And for the first time, I saw him cry. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. No sweeping apologies, no grand gestures. Just two people, both broken in different ways, acknowledging the pain between them. Later, I sat with Fiona in the cafeteria. She toyed with her spoon. "He's not the only one who messed up," she said. "I should have called more." "We all should have," I replied. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window in the hotel room, looking out at the snow. I thought about every year I'd spent wondering, hoping, doubting myself. I thought about the silence, the missed birthdays, the unanswered letters, and I realized the anger wasn't just at him, it was at me too, for letting it harden, for letting it define me. Maybe this Christmas wasn't about homecoming. Maybe it was about unlearning, rebuilding, and letting go of the war that never made headlines, the one inside my own family. The next morning, I visited the chapel on the hospital's second floor, not because I was religious, but because I needed silence that didn't hum with machines. I sat in the last pew and let my shoulders drop. For the first time in years, I prayed not for a miracle, but for clarity, for strength, for the courage to face the version of myself I'd hidden beneath uniforms and silence. And in that quiet space, the anger didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. Grief remained, but now it shared its weight with grace. Recovery doesn't announce itself like a trumpet. It sneaks in slowly. A smile during breakfast, a conversation that doesn't end in silence, a gesture that once would have been withheld. Dad's recovery was slow but steady. He moved from ICU to a regular room. His voice returned, rough but firm. He asked for books, then the newspaper, then a laptop. We all took turns watching him. Mom read to him. Caleb managed store affairs from his bedside. Fiona brought soup. I just sat. Some days we talked, some days not. But one morning he looked at me and said, "I read every one of your letters." I froze. I didn't know what to do with them, so I kept them in the garage in a box labeled M. I opened it after I read the compass engraving. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You kept them?" He nodded. "Every single one." For days after that, we spoke more, carefully, about things that had gone unsaid. He admitted his fear not just of losing me, but of admitting he'd been wrong. He said something that stayed with me. "I thought if I ignored your choice, it would go away, but it didn't. You only grew stronger." That was when I realized he hadn't been punishing me. He'd been punishing himself for not protecting his brother, for not being able to protect me, and in that warped fear, he'd built walls so high even love couldn't climb them. One evening, we were sitting by the window when he said, "I rewrote the will last month, gave you part of the business again." I blinked. "Before I came back?" He nodded. "I didn't want you to think it was guilt." It was the first gesture he'd made in years that said, "I still see you, not as the prodigal, but as my daughter." I didn't want the business, but I accepted the sentiment. As Dad regained strength, we started rebuilding, not perfectly, but deliberately. He didn't apologize every day, but when he did, it was real. I didn't forgive him all at once, but I stopped holding every breath, waiting for him to fail me again. Outside the hospital, life resumed. Fiona invited me to brunch. Caleb asked if I'd consider staying longer. Mom started referring to next Christmas like it was a promise, not a hope. And slowly, Elmridge stopped feeling like enemy territory. One morning, I walked into the store. Customers greeted me. One woman said, "Greg talks about you all the time now. Says you're the brave one." I laughed. "That's new." He smiled. "He's proud, you know. Always was. Just didn't know how to say it." Inside, I wandered the aisles I once stalked, touching the wood grain of the old counter. I remembered summer days in an apron, Dad handing me invoices and calling me boss. That girl had grown into a soldier, and now, something else entirely. That afternoon, Caleb offered me a part-time consulting role, modernizing operations. I said yes, not out of obligation, but because it was a way to stitch myself back into the fabric of this place, on my terms. That night, we had dinner as a family in the hospital lounge. It wasn't fancy, sandwiches and hot cocoa, but it felt like a feast. Dad even joked about the food and mom smacked his arm. Afterwards, he turned to me, "Will you come next Christmas?" I looked around at Fiona laughing, Caleb pouring cider, mom humming, and said, "If I'm invited." He smiled. "You never stopped being invited. I just didn't know how to open the door." That night, I took a walk alone through Chestnut Lane. Snow blanketed the sidewalks and Christmas lights blinked in windows like old friends waving hello. I passed the house where I grew up, now quiet but still standing still hours. In the frosted glass of the window, I caught my reflection. Not the soldier, not the child, just a woman in between, finally standing still long enough to be seen. I paused, hand resting on the gate, and whispered, "I'm home." Not because everything was fixed, but because healing had started. Sometimes that's enough. The weeks after Christmas unfolded like a second chance. Elmridge, blanketed in snow, seemed softer somehow, less like a place that held my pain, more like one that could hold my peace. Dad came home from the hospital mid-January. We helped him settle back in. Caleb handled the store, Fiona managed bills, and I took charge of the kitchen, a role none of us expected, least of all me. I made mistakes, burned toast, oversalted soup, but the laughter that followed was easy, familiar. Every morning, I brewed his coffee just the way he liked it, black, one sugar. He always gave me a nod when he sipped it, never said thank you, but I didn't need the words. That nod was enough. One evening, we watched old home videos. The grainy footage showed my 6th birthday, me in a tiara, riding a plastic horse. Dad was behind the camera, narrating like a sports commentator. "Look at that form," he said as I galloped. We laughed until we cried. It felt like reclaiming something we'd lost. He started calling me kiddo again. I didn't know how much I'd missed that. Then came the letter. I found it in the mail pile one morning in February. A thick envelope, military sealed. I knew before I opened it what it would say. I had been recommended for a leadership role in a defense advisory unit abroad. A prestigious offer, 6 months, high impact, high risk. I didn't tell anyone right away. I folded the letter and slipped it into my coat pocket. That day, I helped Dad reorganize his workshop. We joked about the mess, argued about pegboard spacing, shared a lunch of reheated stew. And all the while, the letter pressed against my chest like a heartbeat I didn't want to acknowledge. That night I sat on the porch swing. The sky was clear, stars scattered like dust. Mom joined me, wrapped in a shawl. "You're quiet," she said. I handed her the letter. She read it, eyes scanning slowly, carefully. When she looked up, she said only, "Are you going?" "I don't know." She nodded. "You love it though, the work, the mission." "I love being here too," I said, finally. She squeezed my hand. "You don't have to choose, just decide which version of peace you're ready for." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Dad. His face froze, then softened. "You should go." I blinked. "You're not angry?" He shook his head. "I was angry when I thought you left to spite me. I was angry when I thought fear could keep you safe. But I'm done letting fear make my decisions." He looked older in that moment, but lighter too. So I accepted the role. My flight was in 2 weeks. We didn't treat it like a countdown. We didn't ignore it either. We just lived. Breakfast, errands, laughter, quiet. One evening, Dad handed me a small package. "Don't open it till you board." The day of my departure, we drove in silence. At the gate, Mom hugged me tight. Fiona whispered, "Right this time." Caleb smirked, "Come back with more stories." And Dad, he hugged me. For the first time in years, really hugged me. "Be safe, kiddo," he said. "Come home." On the plane, I opened the package. Inside was the compass. The engraving had changed. It now read, "No matter how far, you are ours." Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper, a release, a return. I traced the letters with my thumb and closed my eyes. In that moment, I felt tethered, not by guilt or unfinished conversations, but by love. Unspoken, imperfect, hard-won love. As the plane lifted, I looked out over Elm Ridge, now a patchwork of rooftops and frost-kissed trees. I thought of all we'd lost, all we'd gained, how pain had made space for truth and truth for forgiveness. Sometimes happiness doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a compass in your hand, like a voice in your head saying, "Go, you're ready." I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing. And that made all the difference. 6 months passed in a blur. The assignment was challenging. Daily briefings, interagency tensions, unfamiliar terrain. But I thrived. For the first time in years, I felt my experience mattered. My voice carried weight. Yet every night, I checked my phone for messages from home. They came like clockwork. Updates from Caleb, photos from Mom, Fiona's sarcastic memes. Even Dad sent short notes. Workshop got repainted. Coffee still terrible without you. And once missing you, kiddo. I saved that one. In late August, I received a video call. Fiona's face popped up, wide-eyed. "You're coming home, right?" "Depends. Why?" She grinned. "You've got a niece now. Caleb's a dad." The screen shifted. A tiny, wrinkled baby in a pink blanket filled the view. "Her name's Nora." My heart swelled. "I'm coming." When I returned, Elm Ridge was buzzing. Not with news of me, with Nora. I was perfectly happy to be second billing. She was perfect. The house smelled like cinnamon and baby lotion. Caleb was a mess of joy and panic. Fiona softer, Mom radiant. Dad, he looked tired, thinner. His handshake lingered longer than usual. That night, while everyone cooed over Nora, I asked Caleb about Dad. "He's slowing down," he said. "Nothing urgent, just age." I nodded. I didn't need dramatics to understand what time does. A week later, Dad asked me to join him in the workshop. He was sanding a shelf, slow but steady. "I was thinking," he said, "about retiring for good." "You've earned it." I was also thinking, maybe you could take over, not the business, just this space. The workbench, the tools, keep it alive. I blinked. "You trust me not to burn it down?" He chuckled. "You never did burn the house down, just singe the curtains." I looked around the workshop, the memories embedded in the wood, the dust, the light. I'd be honored. The next day, he handed me a box. Inside was every letter I'd written during my service. Chronologically ordered, rubber banded into years. I held them like sacred texts. "I read them all again," he said, "some twice." I wiped my eyes. "You kept the war in here." So I wouldn't have to. He touched my shoulder. "I kept them because I never stopped being proud, just scared." "I know." His health didn't collapse. There was no grand emergency, just more rest, more quiet, a little more leaning on others. That winter, he spent more time in the armchair than the workbench. But he smiled more, hugged more, told stories. One snowy morning, I found him asleep with Nora on his chest, both snoring. I didn't wake them, just watched and smiled. That was the price he paid, I realized, not with punishment, but with the weight of time lost, letters unopened, holidays missed, years unlived. But he paid it generally with change, with vulnerability, with effort. And for me, that was enough. A few weeks later, we threw him a small birthday celebration in the backyard. Nora giggled in his lap while he wore a ridiculous paper crown Caleb had forced on him. As we toasted with cider and grilled cheese, he looked around and said, This is what I fought for." That evening, after everyone left, he and I sat on the porch. He looked out at the trees, fingers curled around a mug of tea. "I used to think I had to be the strong one," he said, "the unshakable. But you taught me that strength isn't silence." I rested my head against his shoulder. And you taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing love anyway. We sat there as night folded over the town, and for the first time in years, there was no tension between us. No ghosts, just breath and space and shared warmth. That didn't need to say sorry anymore. We already had, and I didn't need to be angry anymore. I had already come home. Spring arrived gently in Elmridge. The last snows melted into soft puddles. Buds bloomed on trees like promises kept, and life in its quiet way moved forward. I spent most mornings in the workshop, fixing what needed fixing, letting my hands remember what peace felt like. Sometimes Dad joined me just to sit, sometimes to tinker. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. One morning, I received an email, another offer, this time a long-term post overseas. Good pay, good title, stable future. I stared at the screen for a long time. That evening, I mentioned it over dinner. Caleb looked impressed. Fiona raised an eyebrow. Mom paused mid-salad, and Dad, he just said, "Do what makes you feel alive." I didn't answer then. I needed space to think. That night, I walked down to the river, sat on the old dock, and listened to the frogs. I thought about where I'd been, who I'd become, who I still wanted to be. I didn't want to disappear again, but I also didn't want to stay still out of guilt. The next morning, I packed a bag, not to leave, but to travel for a while, to meet old friends, to visit places I'd only seen from military transports, to breathe as just Maddie, not a soldier, not a daughter, not a fixer. Before I left, I stopped by Dad's chair. "I'm not running," I said, "I just need to stretch." He smiled. "Wings don't work if you never use them." We hugged. No drama, no tears. Caleb drove me to the station. Fiona packed snacks. Mom kissed my forehead 3 times. And as the train pulled out, I didn't feel the weight of leaving. I felt the lightness of returning someday, maybe next Christmas, maybe sooner, but definitely always home. The first stop was a coastal town in Maine, just waves and wind and a tiny inn with creaky floors. I walked for hours, spoke to strangers, wrote postcards I might never send. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was clarifying. Then I visited Rachel, my old friend from the unit. We hadn't seen each other in years. She hugged me like no time had passed. "You look lighter," she said over coffee. "I feel it," I replied. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. She showed me her garden, her dog, her messy, beautiful life. "You ever think of settling down?" she asked. I smiled. "Maybe, one day, when it doesn't feel like settling." We laughed. By the time I reached Colorado, the world felt wider, my mind less tangled. I wasn't searching for answers, just embracing the not knowing. One morning in Denver, I opened my journal and wrote, "Peace isn't one place, it's the freedom to go and still belong somewhere." That evening, I called home. Nora babbled into the phone. Dad chuckled in the background. Mom asked when I'd be back. "Soon," I said, and I meant it, because I'd learned that love doesn't end when you step away. It waits, it grows, and when you're ready, it welcomes you back. Always.